Thanks, John. Good morning.
Good morning.
Wow. You know, never start a brand new series on a holiday. That's what I'm thinking. I might repeat today's message next week for the people who aren't here, who will be here. So I'll let you know if I do that, so you guys can just do something else if you want to, or come back and hear it twice. I usually get more when I hear something twice. But anyway, I'm glad to see you all in the room. We got about 7 folks online with us, so welcome to you all as well, wherever you are. It's great to have everybody worshiping together. And for those of you who aren't in person or online who are catching this later, we're glad that you're doing that as well. But it is a holiday weekend. It's a 4-day weekend for our school system, so lots of people are traveling. They were out Friday. Students are out Monday. So that is what it is. In fact, my wife's out of town, right? She's not even here, so there you go. But anyway, just a few announcements. Small groups are coming up at the end of this month. We'll be getting you that information about what those groups are going to look like, the studies they're going to have, all that good stuff. So be on the lookout for that in the next couple of weeks and plug into a small group. And then the other thing is this, and we've been saying this since COVID, we need lots of volunteers. One of the things that COVID did was decimated our volunteer kind of core base, and that's okay. One of the reasons that happened is because a lot of people, and some of you are in the room, were doing way too much. And then COVID let you take a break, and you realized you were doing too much, and you haven't jumped back into that. And I actually appreciate that because that's healthy, the fact that some of you have taken a step back from doing all that you were doing and focusing on some of the things that you really love to do. But we are looking for volunteers. We need volunteers in our kids ministry. We need some volunteers in our student ministry, which meets on Sunday mornings too. They're starting back next week. In our student ministry, we have 3 volunteers who are committed every week to help with the teaching and the guiding and all that. But we have to have 2 adults in the room whenever we're working with minors, just for safety and security and all of that. So if that's something you're interested in, is being an extra person in the room with our students or with our kids upstairs, we would love to talk to you about that. There's also volunteer opportunities for greeters in hospitality, on our back in the back with our tech. In fact, Kathy jumped in this morning because she saw me back there running the live stream, because our 2 people that normally jump in on that are out of town this week. So thanks, Kathy, for doing that. But there it is. If you want to volunteer somewhere or begin serving somewhere, I'd love to have a conversation with you. If it's kids ministry or student ministry, Elise or I, either one, can talk to you about that. So that said, let's go to God in prayer this morning as we get ready to look into Scripture. God, we thank you for just a day to worship you, and we just pray for those who aren't here this morning, who are traveling, who are away. We just pray they just have a great time if they're with family or friends or wherever they might be, that they would just have a good experience and get some rest and some good family quality time. And then, God, I just pray you would just open our hearts this morning as we look into this story of Esther, that you would just begin to open our hearts and minds to the things you want us to learn from her story and begin applying them to our lives. In Christ's name I pray, amen. So we are starting a new series in the Old Testament book of Esther. We're going to be in it for four weeks. And I just want to give you some of the context for the book of Esther, because if you have kids and your only context for Esther is Veggie Tales, then you probably don't have a full context. So let me just give you the timeline. If you were here last week, you remember we talked about Nehemiah, right? We talked about Nehemiah and how he helped to oversee the rebuilding of the walls around Jerusalem. The nation of Israel had been in captivity in Babylon for about 70 years, and the king began to allow the nation of Israel to kind of go back. They kind of trickled back to the homeland just to begin rebuilding everything there. So lots and lots of people had begun returning to Israel to start rebuilding the cities and rebuilding the nation. But some of the Israelites decided to stay behind. Some of them decided to stay in Babylon. And I mean, if you think about it, some of them 70 years, right? Some of them, like Esther, were born there. They were raised there. That was kind of all they knew. And so some of them stayed behind in Babylon, while most of the other Jewish people moved back to Jerusalem. So the book of Esther follows this group of people who decided to stay behind in Babylon. And Esther's story, it begins in 483 BC, and at this point, Babylon has been conquered by the nation of Persia. Persia is kind of the up-and-coming superpower in the world at that point. And Esther's parents, they were among the group of people who decided to stay behind in Babylon, in Persia, and not return to Jerusalem. So Esther was born and raised in Persia. Her parents died when she was a young girl, and her cousin Mordecai took her in and raised her as his own daughter. Okay, so that's kind of where we are at this point in the story. Esther is an orphaned teenage girl living in a foreign land at a time when her people group were scattered all around and were really vulnerable to the powers within the world. And the king of Persia at this time was a guy by the name of Xerxes. And Xerxes, if you read the book of Esther, you'll see, and we'll see this along the way, but Xerxes was just this very arrogant and impulsive kind of a guy. And we see that at the very, very beginning of the book of Esther. In chapter 1 of Esther, we're told that Xerxes had this huge banquet for all of the Persian officials. It's all guys. It's a banquet that lasts for 7 days, we're told, and it's all the food you could eat for 7 days, and all the alcohol you can drink for 7 days, and it was essentially like being on a cruise without a boat, right? I mean, that's what this was. And during this banquet, with all this food and all this drink, King Xerxes, no surprise here, he gets just drunk, right, along with all the other people that are there. And as he gets drunk, he begins to brag about the beauty of the queen, whose name was Vashti. But it's not the good kind of bragging, right? It's not bragging where he's saying things like his wife is, just the most beautiful woman in the world. He's so fortunate to have her as his wife or anything. That's the good kind of bragging. He's bragging. His bragging was more like, when you treat your wife like a possession, right? And you're essentially showing her off to make yourself look good. That's what Xerxes was doing. So King Xerxes, he summons Queen Vashti to come to this banquet, this 7-day drunk fest, and he essentially wants her to parade around in front of all of these men that are there. And to her credit, Queen Vashti refuses to do that. And in response to that, her refusing to do what he's told her to do, King Xerxes, he calls an emergency cabinet meeting, right, of all of his top officials. And in this meeting, they discuss all this, and they decide to strip the queen of her crown. They banish her from the palace, and they banish her essentially into obscurity. And I'm pretty sure somewhere down the line, if you were to track King Xerxes' family tree, Henry VIII ended up in that tree somewhere along the way, because this is the kind of guy that he was, right? If you're familiar with Henry VIII's story, which most of us probably are. But anyway, all of this is in chapter 1, okay? I'm not going to read any from chapter 1 today. We're going to look at some of chapter 2, but you should go back and you should read chapter 1, because it's just full of all kinds of drama and all of this stuff. And not only did this happen in chapter 1, but the officials, they're talking about all this, and they tell King Xerxes that he needs to send out a decree. He needs to send out a decree to all the provinces in Persia, to all the territories in the kingdom, and the decree that says that this kind of behavior on the part of the wives is just not going to be tolerated. That's what they tell him he needs to do, because the officials, they were scared to death. They were scared that wives everywhere might start thinking for themselves, and that wives everywhere might start making up their own minds, and this just completely terrified them all. And so the king sends out a decree, and it basically says, and again, this is all in chapter 1. You need to read chapter 1. But his decree basically says this, and I'm kind of summarizing here, but it basically says the men are still in charge. Right? Ladies, just in case there was any doubt in your mind, just in case you were wondering, the men are still in charge, and you need to respect their decisions no matter how stupid and how selfish they are. Okay? So now, hopefully we all get our view of marriage and male-female relationships more from Jesus and less from King Xerxes. Right? Now, since King Xerxes has banished the one queen that he had, he now has to find another one. And so now he issues another decree. And that decree is basically the establishment of an international beauty pageant, a nationwide beauty contest to find the next queen. So we pick this up in chapter 2. I'm going to read, it's a little bit of a long read, and then we're going to kind of break it down a little bit. But here's what happened. When the king's order and edict for this national beauty parlor had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa. Susa was the capital city, and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, and who was in charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor, and immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. And then jumping down, before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, and 6 months of oil of myrrh, and 6 weeks with perfumes and cosmetics. And some of you ladies are probably starting to boil a little bit at this text, aren't you? I don't blame you. Back to the story. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her, with her from the harem to the king's palace. And this next part of the story, I don't think I need to be explicit about what this is talking about. I think the text is explicit enough about what's going on here. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shashgad, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. And when the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tibeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her the queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave her a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all of his nobles and his officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. So the king sets out, right, to find the most beautiful woman in the land, all of these beautiful women in the land to kind of compete against each other for who would be the next queen. And scholars estimate that as many as maybe 1,000 young women were brought to the palace, to the citadel and the city of Susa. And verse 8 in that passage makes it really, really clear in the context and in the Hebrew that these young women didn't have a choice in this matter. They were brought here by force. They were given year-long beauty treatments to prepare them to spend one night with the king. Now, after they spend that one night with the king, essentially one of four things would happen to them. One was, if the king didn't like them, they would become a permanent part of his concubines, but they would never be in the presence of the king again. And if the king liked them, they would become concubines who occasionally would be called to be with the king. And then there were the 2 or 3 young women who he liked the most, who would eventually become his wives, and their children would be heirs and would receive all the rights and privileges that came with that. And then finally, the one that he liked the most, he would essentially give a rose to, and he would make her his wife. Now, I just made up that part about the rose, for those of you who are Bachelor fans, right? But if The Bachelor reminds us of anything, right, it's that over 2,500 years later, we really haven't come very far, have we? I mean, when Esther meets the king, she is favored above all the rest, and so the king marries Esther, he makes her his queen, and this little orphan girl from a persecuted religious minority becomes the second richest person in the land. Now, there are 2 things that I want us to notice in this story, and the first thing is this. I want you to notice that the power of culture to define who we are and to shape our identity. That we're told in verse 4 of chapter 1, again, you need to read chapter 1, but we're told that for 180 days, this is before this 7-day banquet, but for 180 days leading up to this big drunk fest banquet that the king had, for 180 days, King Xerxes puts on full display all of his wealth for the people of Persia to see. It takes him 180 days to parade all of his wealth in front of the people. I mean, that's how much wealth he had. That's how many possessions he owns. And then in chapter 2, we have this international beauty pageant, right, that we just read about. And those two events pretty much summed up how your worth was defined in that time period. In the Persian culture in the 5th century BC, the important thing about a man was his wealth and his power. And the most important thing about a woman was her beauty. Now, we tend to look at that through our 21st century judgmental eyes and say, well, that's just terrible, right? I mean, that's just awful, the way that ancient cultures valued men and valued women. But basically, our culture does the same thing today, doesn't it? Beauty, wealth, and power, they still drive our culture and determine our worth in our culture. And it might actually be worse today. It's even more pervasive today, I think, than it was in the 5th century, because it's not just that men's worth that's driven by wealth and power, and it's not just women's worth that's driven by physical attractiveness, but beauty, wealth, and power tend to define both men and women in today's culture. In our culture, the external matters so much more than what's on the inside. And like in Esther, our culture, it still pushes us to go through beauty treatments of sorts. The beauty treatments may look different for men and women at times, but everyone is still pushed to go through some sort of beauty treatment in order to get to the top. And the good news is that Jesus sets us free from all of that. He sets us free from culture's beauty regimens. Whether it's the regiment that makes you financially beautiful, or the regiment that makes you physically beautiful, the regiment that makes you vocationally beautiful. And it's not that those things are unimportant. It's just that when you choose to follow Jesus, they no longer have to define you, and they no longer have to determine your value and your worth. When we realize that on the cross, Jesus gave up his beauty to make us beautiful, we become less obsessed with our own beauty, however it's defined. When we realize that what Jesus did for us on the cross is ultimately what defines our beauty and our worth, and we no longer need to find our beauty and our worth in how we look, or how much we have, or in what we succeed in, or what our successes are. The second thing I want you to notice about this story is how God is at work behind the scenes. In fact, we're going to see this throughout this entire series and throughout this entire book. One of the things that makes the book of Esther so unique to any other book in the Bible is that it's the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God. In fact, there's no mention of God anywhere in the entire book. There's no reference to prayer. There's no reference to prophecy. There's nothing particularly religious at all in the book. I mean, on the surface, it appears that God is completely absent from the book of Esther. But as you read the story, and as you begin to see the story kind of unfold, and you begin to understand the story, you begin to see that God is clearly at work behind the scenes to restore and to redeem things. It may seem like Esther's journey from an orphaned teenage girl to the queen of the Persian Empire was just a series of unlikely coincidences. But as you take a closer look, you see God's fingerprint all over the story. God is at work, even in the midst of even abusive power that we see in the story, even in the midst of a demeaning structure, even in the midst of seemingly random encounters. God is at work. And God is at work working out his plan in Persia's halls of power, and he's at work working out his plans in just ordinary households. God is at work redeeming it all. Ordinary stuff is happening in this broken culture that on the surface doesn't seem all that miraculous or extraordinary, but behind all of this extraordinary stuff, God is doing his work. And as we're going to see next week, God was positioning Esther to ultimately save her people from harm and to fulfill God's promise to Abraham that God would use Abraham's family to bring healing and restoration to the entire world. Here's the deal. Sometimes it's easier to see God's work when we look back on it. It seems like in our spiritual journeys, hindsight's always 20/20, isn't it? There's something about looking back where we can see that God was at work and what seemed like just really ordinary stuff. But when we take a look back at it, we can say things like, wow, I would not be anywhere near where I am today had God not been a part of that. I mean, that's true as I think about that. That's true for me. That's true for me about how I ended up here at Fairfax Circle. I don't think I've ever told you this story. But I've been here 30 years serving in this church, Marcia and I have. And the way Marcia and I got here was through several twists and turns that as we look back can only be explained in part by God working in some ordinary ways. I was in Louisville, Kentucky. I was finishing up my seminary degree there. Marcia had just finished up a year before her undergraduate degree, and we'd gotten married. And she'd gotten her undergraduate degree in psychology, and she was actually planning on going on after I finished seminary to get a master's degree in counseling. And she was looking at a school in Texas. In fact, we'd made a trip to Texas to look at the school, and that's where she'd kind of decided to go. But then she got a job. I had another year and a half left of school, so she got a job as an interpreter at a social work agency. It was in southern Indiana, just right across the river from where Louisville was, if you're familiar with that area. And it was through her relationship with a couple of people that she worked there. She worked with a social worker who was her boss, and then there was another guy on the team of three who was deaf, and he was a social worker. And she was the interpreter for the team. And they covered 14 rural counties in southern Indiana. And so she traveled all over the place with this team, providing social services to deaf people. And it was through that relationship and through that job that she realized if she really wanted to be a counselor for the deaf, she needed to be educated by the deaf. And so she needed to go to a deaf university. And so she decided she needed to go to Gallaudet University, which is right down the road in Washington, D.C. And so that's what she started planning on. She filled out the application, sent all of the stuff in, got her 3 references that she had to have all lined up, and sent her people the information they had to fill out for their references. They had to get that back to the admissions office. And one of her references was her boss in Indiana, a guy named Marcus. And it turns out Marcus was really good friends with the dean of the counseling program at Gallaudet University, right? And since he knew the guy personally, he thought, well, I'm just going to, fill out this form, right, that admissions needs, and I'm just going to write a note to my friend just telling him how great Marcia is and all of that. So he does. He sends all of this straight to the dean. Now, I got to tell you, there was a deadline for you getting all of your application stuff in. And they only took 10 people into the counseling program a year at Gallaudet. And so a couple weeks later, she was past the deadline, a couple weeks after the deadline. She hadn't heard anything from anybody. And so she calls. And she found out her application had never been forwarded to the counseling department for consideration. And when she began to ask why, they said, well, it was incomplete. She said, I got everything into you. What are you talking about? They said, well, there was a reference letter that's missing. And it was Marcus's reference letter because the dean had gotten it and laid it on his desk and didn't forward it on to admissions. And so admissions didn't check the box. And so it wasn't complete. So it never got forwarded onto the counseling department. And they'd already made their 10 selections. So obviously she was devastated. Well, a few days later, she got a call from Gallaudet. And the same thing had happened to another student. And when they looked at both of these students' stuff, they were really impressed with what they were seeing. And so they said, we're gonna make an exception this year, and we're gonna have 12 people in the program instead of this 10. But there's a catch. You've got to get here ASAP because we've already started doing the personal interviews that we have to do. And you have to be here in person to do an interview. So we book a flight for 2 weeks later to be in the D.C. metro area. Marcia grew up in this area. Her parents lived over in southern Maryland. And so we've got a flight booked to be here. Well, at the same time, I was applying for ministry positions all around the D.C. metro area. And somehow my resume ended up here with the search team that was looking for a student pastor, an associate pastor for student Ministries. And so they were looking through resumes, and I made the cut, right? In fact, they narrowed it down to me and one other person. And so I got this call from somebody I'd never heard from before, somebody I'd never met. Her name was Beth Blair. Some of you know Beth. And she begins to explain who she is and where she's at church. And, hey, we've got your resume and all of that. And we would like for you to come for an interview. Can you maybe come for an interview in the next few weeks? And I said, yeah, not only can I come from an interview, I've already got a plane ticket, right? It's not even going to cost your church. It's already paid for. You know, you have to spend a dime on bringing me there. So we made the trip, right? And we had both of our interviews, and kind of the rest is history there. But here's the deal. Later, and this was about a year, maybe a year and a half later, I didn't know this. I was having a conversation with Beth. She worked on our staff, she ran the preschool that we used to have here. And we were talking about this in the office with a couple of other people and all that. And she told me something that I didn't know. She said, you know, we interviewed the other person that also made the cut a week before we interviewed you. And we really liked them. In fact, we were ready to hire them. And we actually talked about, as a committee, about canceling our interview with you. But we decided that since you already had a plane ticket, and you're already coming, and it wasn't costing the church anything anyway, we might as well go ahead and sit down and talk with you. And then when we met you, we wanted to hire you. But she said, if you had not already had that plane ticket, we would not have interviewed you. We would have canceled it. And so when I look back on that, right, it's really easy to see God at work in all of that. God at work in that mishap where Marcus thought he was helping Marcia, but he was actually potentially hurting her. You know, God at work in the timing of it all. And to see God at work in that search committee that almost pulled the plug on an interview but decided to go forward with it. To see God at work in all of those things and how God kind of wove all of those things together in order to do something and to accomplish something. But here's the deal. When we're in the middle of it, when we're in the present and we're going through that stuff, you know, right now, it's really, really easy to miss what God is doing. The story of Esther challenges us to recognize that God is at work even when we can't see it. That God is at work in the ordinary and sometimes even in the messy, unexpected events of life. Esther is the unlikely story of how God is at work even in the brokenness of humanity to do something extraordinary. And the story of Esther also reminds us that God can use anyone from anywhere at any time, no matter what their story is, to advance his kingdom. If God can use an orphaned teenage girl functioning in a secular, hostile environment, demeaning environment, the Persian Empire, God can use you, and he can use your unique circumstances, whatever they are, to advance his redemptive work in this world. So, I'm going to pray this morning as we close. And I'm going to pray. And as I pray, I'm going to invite you to just pray along with me, just in your heart, silently. And as you hear this prayer, wherever it is that you identify in this prayer, I hope that you will make that part your prayer. So let's go to God in prayer. God, I confess that sometimes I get caught up in the world's beauty regiment. I get caught up in the pursuit of financial beauty or physical beauty, or the beauty of success, or the beauty of accomplishment, the beauty of performance, or some other kind of external beauty. And God, sometimes I find my identity and my worth in those things. So God, thank you for sending your son who died on the cross. And God, help me to find my identity and my worth in you. God, I confess that sometimes when I cannot see you at work in the extraordinary and obvious ways, I begin to doubt that you're working at all. So God, help me to trust you even when I cannot see you. Help me to see that your silence is not apathy and your hiddenness is not abandonment. God, help me to see you in the ordinary and in the routine. And God, may I see the unique circumstances of my life, not as limitations, but as opportunities. God, like Esther, help me to steward the position that you have placed me in to advance your kingdom and to bring restoration to the people around me. God, I say yes to whatever it is you're calling me to do. in Jesus' name. Our team's going to lead us in our song of response this morning, or lead us in our closing song. And I hope wherever you are, you'll continue to make that prayer your prayer. Let's stand and sing.